Hello, everybody. So today we're going to talk about digital sentience. Can digital computers ever wake up? And I actually expect these to be one of the most controversial videos in this channel. I even expect it to be kind of a little bit emotional for some of you guys, just because some of what I will say, in a sense, may even tackle, kind of some load-bearing beliefs for, I don't know, worldview and perhaps even one's place in the world. So apologies in advance if it has that effect. It's not the intended effect, but it might be a side effect of this discussion. So I will basically partition this talk into roughly three segments. The first one is essentially establishing my credibility and talking a little bit about kind of my philosophical journey, so that you have some context and background about okay, who I am and why should you listen to what I have to say on this topic. The second one is going to be kind of like a classical issues in philosophy of mind, classic thought experiments, and why they may push us in one direction or another. And the final component is kind of a much more QRI, Quality Research Institute themed discussion about this issue, where I will be going over some of the arguments that we have presented and basically the lens that we use. And in the end, I will conclude with some remarks about the big picture, basically how we actually see everything fitting together in a way that truly makes sense, and I think actually solves a lot of these classic issues in philosophy of mind. But before I get started, the qualia of the day is the intentional stance. So this is Leona. She's been featured in some qualia computing articles in the past. So here's the fascinating thing, right? Like if I tell you oh, she just got a promotion at her job, she's so happy, telling you that sort of thing. You may even notice kind of you're creating these you're spawning little toy models of kind of the interior mental life of Leona, by telling you some properties about her. Or if I tell you, she's really, really angry at Link because Link didn't invite him to, I don't know, his birthday party or something like that. But no, actually they're really good friends. And plus, they appear in the article, Wireheading Done Right. So they're pretty happy folks. But you see, we create kind of these, free-floating mental models all the time, and then we assign them to quote-unquote agents within our world simulation, and that feels like something. It really has an effect. And I had a very early acquaintance with this kind of a phenomenon. I remember one of my very earliest memories was in Euro Disney in France. I was, I think, 3 years old, and we went to this exhibit. I don't remember the name, but basically it was some kind of overview of the future, and there was a very charismatic robot, presenting, and I saw it, from the back row or something, and thinking, oh my gosh, there's a actual robot and he's guiding us and people are paying attention to that robot. Oh my gosh, I didn't know there were these kind of entities in this world. And I was so impressed, and I thought man, I'm sure I will start meeting robots all the time from now on. Maybe this is just the beginning. And I remember when the event was ending, that I asked my mom whether we could go on stage and talk to the robot, and then she had to explain, well, I think these are mechatronics. They're not, basically it's a prefabricated message and pre-recorded, it's not the robot is coming up with those ideas on the fly. And for sure there's nobody in the robot, so to speak. It's just kind of machinery. And I thought about it and I realized oh yeah, actually there is this kind of dissociation in a sense, things that can look like they are conscious, that they have an interior life, oftentimes they don't, and vice versa. Actually there's things that a coma patient may actually have some degree of mental life, but just not look like it at all, right? So you can kind of dissociate these two. And then the question really comes up, which is like, okay, so what is the appropriate criteria that we should use in order to actually infer that, like a particular system is conscious, has an interior life? And I mean, very importantly, I think that this debate has many, many layers, and there's kind of a popular culture kind of like layer, which really comes down to something like, like, hey, on the one hand, like, if the brain is really just an information processing system, like, doesn't that mean that, like, digital computers will eventually be conscious? And then on the other hand, you have, people saying like, yeah, but machines cannot have feelings, like a computer is cold and hard and made of silicon, it doesn't have feelings, that is the level of debate, in popular culture, and you see it in movies and cartoons and like, fiction and pop writing and so on, which is I mean, just barely scratching the surface. And the thing that you will realize is that, in a sense, there's a bit of a kind of a meta-contrarian dynamic here, in that, like, the obvious idea, that, like, hey, like, only humans are conscious, is then kind of, like, challenged by some observations about, for example, that, like, other animals may look different, they have, like, different genes and so on, but perhaps, like, they are conscious. And kind of like that generalizes to, okay, like maybe machines could be conscious. And then people come in like, well, there's the intentional stance, and maybe you're just projecting that into the algorithms. And then there's kind of another layer that turns it around and has like some arguments against it. And but the thing is that nowadays in our culture, really kind of the bucket ends at, just like very smart people who are, for the most part, kind of doing AI research, because of all of the impressive results that are coming from that field is, basically what people pay attention to. And by and large, people in, the field of AI, as well as like modern, analytic philosophy, by and large, like the main views tend to be essentially like functionalism, computational theory of mind, and causal structural theories, which I'll get into in a second. Those are kind of the lenses that are used in order to approach this question. And yes, I mean, from those points of view, appropriately programmed digital computers can be conscious. And that's the thing, is like, this is a smart person view. It's the result of kind of like an intricate debate. And that's where, like, the smart people are at this point in time, 2021. And definitely I want to respect and honor that, because it actually takes quite a bit of, intellectual sophistication to get to the point where eventually, things such as like multiple realizability are like intuitive notions. So you live by and you use to interpret the world, and, all the power to them. That is like a sophisticated worldview. It's, as I said, it's a smart person view for sure, but it's wrong. It's just wrong. Okay, so let me now go on to establish my credibility. Okay, so here's the thing, right? Like, people who say digital computers will never be conscious do tend to, for the most part, be kind of empathizers as opposed to systematizers. And they will have arguments like computers cannot have feelings because, feelings are like warm and squishy, whereas, a computer is like hard, cold silicon, things like that. That is and 99.9% of the cases, when somebody says that they think digital computers cannot be conscious, that's the sort of thing that they bring up. So I understand the annoyance. I really do understand the annoyance when it comes to people basically having strong opinions here without necessarily being able to justify them rationally. And, okay, so why is it annoying? Because okay, like when somebody says, hey, let me present you my friend who's also interested in the same topics as you're interested in. And then it turns out that that friend is A, yes, very interested in those topics, B, very opinionated, and C, ignorant about the debates, the classic debates, and where the debate actually is at. Interacting with people like that is actually very annoying, because they don't necessarily have a respect for the fine level of argumentation that underlies your current belief structure. And if you want to, in a sense, engage with somebody's deeply held beliefs, you kind of do require to go over why they believe it, in a sense, like go into the nitty-gritty and understand like, okay, causally, what is influencing your model of the world such that this actually makes a lot of sense. And that's, yeah, something that I'll try to do today. I should add a caveat that, like, this is such a huge debate that it would actually take me something like 10 hours to really go very deep into all of these topics. So think of this video as like more of an overview. I will try to, say meaningful, novel, interesting things at the object level. But yeah, it's kind of an overview. If anybody's really interested in like any particular aspect of debate, please write a comment. I'm happy to compile those, and eventually I'll make a video response. Okay, so what kind of person I am? I would say that I'm both a systematizer and an empathizer. I really have like kind of a strong blend of the two. But because I actually grew in a family of empathizers. I mean, my core family, they're humanities. They're like mostly kind of like arts and humanities, like sociology, linguistics. I do have like scientists in my family, but they're like a little bit more. My grandfather was a scientist. I have cousins and uncles, but my immediate family is like much more like empathizers. And from an early age, like there was this interesting contrast that that like their consensus would be slightly different than how I would approach things, partly because I would bring like such a strong systematizing mindset to problems. So when I was like 6 years old, for example, like I had decided that I wanted to be a physicist, mathematician, and an inventor. And I was really, really curious about like big questions in philosophy and science, the cosmos and so on. Like I was a very nerdy kid in that sense. And I would even define myself as like hyper philosophical in the sense that I experienced like intense, you could say like pangs of like existential wonder and crisis, sort of like just like not knowing what the hell is going on with reality, and like experiencing it as a consistent and persistent problem that needs to be solved. So in some sense I may not actually be like super genius or something like that, but I do stick to these problems day and night. I all the time I'm munching on these problems. And I do think like, basically the amount of hours that you put in on a particular question, especially difficult, questions like in philosophy, it really makes a difference. Are you like a 1,000 hourer or like a 10,000 hourer on, thinking about these problems? And I think it matters. But also just as a kind of like background, my style from an early age has been like, okay, take axioms very, very seriously and see where they lead to, and even if they lead to strange places, bite the bullet, because if you agree with the axioms, you've got to agree with the conclusions. And I remember, for example, when I was 8 years old, I arrived all alone at the implication that determinism must be true, based on basically principles that like the laws of physics are like, fully deterministic and I didn't know about quantum mechanics at the time, but like, just Newton's laws, basically they're like reversible and they're deterministic. And if they're deterministic locally, I arrived at the implication that it also must be the case globally. And, that from the moment there was any kind of information since the Big Bang, everything has been entailed by the laws of physics. And, it was very crazy because I remember thinking this through, just like logically and philosophically, and then trying to communicate that to other people, and they just didn't get it at all. Like, and it was like very strange. I'd imagine it would have been a pretty strange contrast. This 80-year-old trying to explain it to, the teacher in elementary school, or like the friends of my parents, and then things like that. And like, I don't think they understood the argument. I think they generally thought. Psychoanalyzed me, right? Like they would think like, well, if this kid thinks that everything is determined, like maybe this kid is depressed. Is this kid like maybe thinking that things are too routine? There's not enough novelty. Like everything feels determined. Whereas like no. I was like seriously making a philosophical argument, very much along the lines of like the arguments that previous philosophers did many years ago. Like Laplace, I believe, actually presented a argument in favor of determinism that actually looked very much like it. And another example, is kind of I remember being shown the Monty Hall problem about like the three gates and like which one you whether you choose to switch or not. And I must have been like also 8 years old, and I remember like spending like actually like a whole hour just thinking about it, and then like reasoning through, and yes, concluding that you should actually switch. It was very counterintuitive to me, but working through all of the possibilities and thinking carefully, I realized yes, actually switching makes sense. And again, like being confronted with, for example, talking to an actual math undergraduate who was mentoring me at the time, and like trying to convince him that actually you should switch. And actually, he even though he was a math undergrad, he was trying to convince this 80-year-old kid that no, like the chances are the same, 50-50. So I've had like a lot of experiences like that where for whatever reason I was actually completely correct in my reasoning, and just experienced like kind of this weird resistance from people around me just based on intuitions that they just didn't follow these same aesthetic of actually taking seriously the principles and then biting the bullet when whatever comes up as a consequence. And that is actually the sort of vibe that you get in places like AI conferences, and like people who are like really smart nowadays, like the nerds have won, so to speak, and in a sense, like I recognize, like as a kid, I inferred that, hey, if it is possible to create sentient robots, maybe even within my lifetime, like that is going to be the main plot point, like this is just like so incredibly consequential, you have no idea. And I remember just talking to other people that ultimately is like they didn't see the significance in that. Whereas, if you go to a AI conference or a less wrong meetup or Slate Star Codex or all of those wonderful places with very smart and systematizing nerds, they take these super seriously, and I love that. That's fantastic. That feeds my inner child, my rebellious systematizer, being in a sea of empathizers who just don't get it. Okay, so that is quite great. Maybe also, hopefully this doesn't sound too arrogant. I mean, actually, I think it's a little bit braggy, but it's the sort of thing that like actually people change their mind about you when you do explain this sort of thing, even though they say it may be arrogant. So, also as a kid, like 11 years old, 12 years old, I I had like this hobby of basically creating societies online, interesting societies. The first one I created was community for intellectuals, scientists, and philosophers. I was like 11 years old, and I put up a website and like tried to find the others, so to speak. Like, where are the other hyper philosophical kids for me to talk to? And truth be told, I actually got really lucky that like there was a really, really smart, like very awesome friend in elementary school. Like the two of us would actually understand each other. He understood the arguments for determinism, even though we were 9 years old. And he's a good friend, lifelong friendship. And but it was just so difficult to find like others. Now I look back and it's like maybe my strategies weren't really great. And truth be told, like nowadays with QRI and even you guys who watch these videos, like it actually feels like it is finding the others, the people who actually kind of live at this intersection of interests, and combining kind of hyper systematizing thinking together with basically focusing on what matters, quote unquote, like identifying the truly morally significant aspects of reality and then focusing on those. And anyway, that's like very rare, and like I'm very happy I'm kind of finding the others. So welcome welcome aboard. But yeah, I mean, it was an uphill battle. And like another strategy that I tried when I was maybe 14 years old is I literally founded a high IQ society. I created an IQ test. I learned about how to do the statistics of norming a test, and I was very, it was my hobby. Like my hobby was downloading high range with unlimited time IQ tests, and just like spending a whole afternoon just like trying to figure that out, and I remember I was like, I don't know, a teenager, and like getting into these high IQ societies obviously meant for adults, and anyway, like if anybody's interested in these, like there is one really awesome IQ test that I actually endorse as like really cool, which is a Fori Tensum made by Andreas Morgensson or something like that, a Finnish guy who's interested in, high range IQ tests. And that test is beautiful because there's no instructions. They don't tell you what you're supposed to do. It's just a bunch of like interesting shapes. There is an answer sheet and there is like the test, and like part of the test is figuring out like what you're supposed to do. That was such a good test. I spent like at least like 30 hours trying to solve it, and I got into several high IQ societies because of my score on that test. Again, it's a very odd pastime, and I was just very driven to find other people I could philosophize with. And I've got to be completely honest that the quality of people that I found in high IQ societies was very disappointing when it comes to philosophy. I mean, like, they were puzzle solvers, and for sure you could like come up with like cool puzzles and they would be very interested, and you could gain status by making interesting puzzles. And that's great, that's fun. But no, were they interested in like consciousness or advancing the kind of like our field of understanding in that? Like, no, for the most part, people who are in high IQ societies are unfortunately compensating for one reason or another. And yeah, it's kind of sad often. Again, I have made like some good friends from those communities. Then I moved on to I realized like, well, probably people not here necessarily, so how about like something like much more like formal and perhaps even more aligned with like mainstream. And that's what, yeah, I got into participating in math Olympiads and competitions in general. And I mean, just being very, very honest, like one of the main reasons I was very into like that kind of competition was so I could find the others. Basically, okay, like maybe in the selection of the top 16, the gold medalist of the math Olympiad across the entire country, like maybe among them we will find like some people who really have like interesting ideas that are worth discussing. And I did find that like it was like more, like far more than average for sure. Like when I got a gold medal in the Mexican National Math Olympiad and got to basically hang out in like the trainings for the selection for the International Math Olympiad, that was like really fun. Like that was a fun community, but they weren't like philosophically like super talented. They were just like decent. And like I also went to one like international like in Panama, not the IMO, but like a Caribbean one, and like also there like I found it was kind of the same. And maybe I should mention like this is definitely like ego, but also yeah, maybe worth sharing. Like there's a reason I didn't go to the IMO, which is like actually in the last year I participated in the Mexican Math Olympiad. I actually ended up being in the 7th place, well, tied with the 6th place, and then in the tie breaking by 2 points, which of course I remember very, not the opposite of dearly. Yeah, by just 2 points. He won, and I was the 7th place, and only the top 6 go to the International Math Olympiad. But the thing is, like, I still had like 2 more years to participate, and I'm pretty confident in those 2 years I would have actually gone to the IMO. And my calibration is I would probably have gotten a bronze medal with like a slim chance of a silver medal, given on how I was performing on those tests. But I chose to instead go to a United World College in Norway because I got a scholarship for that. And in the final analysis, I think I made the right call. Like it was a different strategy of like finding the others. It's like, okay, like not necessarily the absolute top people in like math specifically, but kind of like, hey, like people who are like pretty holistic in their thinking and basically want to prevent wars by uniting the world through basically education. And the UWC vibe is also really good. I endorse it for the most part. It has its limitations for sure. There's things it can't really process properly, but on the whole is a pretty good vibe. But also it didn't turn out to be kind of the shelling point for like hyper philosophical kids that I had hoped. And not even, as it turns out, like Stanford, when I started my undergraduate degree, I had in my mind the hope, that like everybody in my dorm was going to be like super interested in philosophy and very curious about reality. And the truth was that they were like much more normal than I had anticipated. But within university, within Stanford, I ended up actually finding that there were three the clusters of people that where I could actually find to some extent the others. The first one was the symbolic systems program, which is basically what I ended up studying, which is a cognitive science kind of makeshift program at Stanford, and wonderful people there who are actually hyper philosophical and combine kind of interest in computer science and consciousness and AI, and that's great. The other one was actually this kind of very druggy house, the Enchanted Broccoli Forest, and like literally, I think it is one of the couple places where like people would actually like be interested in psychedelics, and like not like most people at those houses were like just party animals, so to speak, but among the people who had interest in consciousness and interesting experiences to discuss, that was actually a very big hub. And the last one was the Stanford Transhumanist Association, which I co-founded with Faust the Whale, and that was a wonderful call. Like, I'm very grateful to Faust the Whale for suggesting it, because founding this association all of a sudden opened up basically my ability to connect with a lot of people that ended up being far more kind of these finding the others, people who have kind of that overlapping set of interests. And basically that's kind of like really what got me very involved in kind of the seeds of effective altruism, and basically a bunch of like functionalist theories of consciousness. I should say too that like even like, for example, like philosophy classes, like I was pretty disappointed in a sense that like even most philosophy students, even graduate students in philosophy, actually they didn't seem particularly hyper philosophical in the relevant sense. Like it seemed like much more of a career or a day job rather than like an intense obsession to figure out what's true. Okay, so that, and I swear, like for many years, like literally the main topic I would bring up at like parties, and pretty much any person I would talk to would be like issues of personal identity, and like in what ways like our common sense notion of identity is wrong, and like how that influences like ethics and ontology. The other one was digital sentience, because again I had like grasped that like if digital sentience is possible, like that is going to be the main plot point of our lifetimes. And what happened? Well, I met David Pierce, who I had read before, which was great, but I hadn't like delved into his philosophy of mind, and it wasn't actually until we invited him to Stanford because of the Stanford Transhumanist Association that I got to talk with him one-on-one. And I've got to admit that like I respected him very highly because of all of his writings on drugs and like ethics and the hedonistic imperative and a bunch of stuff. But like when he told me that he thinks that digital computers will never be conscious, I kind of just being very candid, like that, like slowly, like slightly, kind of like recalibrates how smart I thought he was. It's kind of like downwards. He's like, oh, okay, he's probably one of the people who falls for one of the bad arguments for like why digital computers cannot be conscious. It's like, it's okay. I still like him. He's still right in like almost everything else, but like it's fine. He doesn't have to be fine. He doesn't have to be right about everything. But the joke was on me. Because after very long conversations, and after meeting him like multiple times, like for a total of like maybe 20 hours of like one-on-one conversations, eventually he changed my mind. And I don't know, maybe it was a little bit embarrassing to me. It's like I had like built up so much kind of like momentum into this worldview, basically a functionalist or a computational theory of mind account of consciousness. And so much of my, personality, many of my drives were towards, hey, what's going to happen when we build a digital computer? And all of a sudden that collapsed because he had actually really good arguments. Okay, so what are those arguments? Yes, so let's get into that. One more thing is I also TA'd basically, a philosophy of mind course at Stanford. And I've got to say also that, like, have talked to so many people in the, less wrong and effective altruism cluster. And I know their arguments. I've read a bunch of less wrong. And if it wasn't because of David Pierce, that would be, what I would be advocating. And I think it would be basically the smart person view that I would be pursuing. But the truth is a little bit more interesting than that, actually. So let's get into it. So first, bad arguments. It is absolutely true that when you try to convince somebody that digital computers can be conscious, they will say things such as, you can simulate glucose. You can simulate a plant in your computer with software. But no matter how detailed that simulation is, it will always be ones and zeros. You never have an actual glucose molecule emerge out of that simulation. And I've got to say, that's a terrible argument against digital sentience. And it's almost embarrassing when you hear somebody being so confident about an argument like that. The reason why it doesn't work is because the whole point of something like computational theories of consciousness is that, these patterns may not, create a glucose molecule in kind of like our level of abstraction, but relative to the other patterns that are going on in the simulation, if it plays functionally and causally the same role as a glucose molecule, it is a glucose molecule within that simulation. And now connecting that layer with kind of like our basement reality layer might not be trivial. There might be ways of doing it with, for example, like VR and like Neuralink implants and things like that, where actually you kind of end up interacting with something that is, in a sense, like just as real as the things around you. But it is very silly otherwise, to kind of say that, you don't get like physical glucose molecules out of a simulation. Like, that's a terrible argument. And like that, there is just so many like bad arguments. And I think, basically this starts, basically the part where I actually give you some kind of like important background frameworks so that we can actually make progress here. And then I will go over the classic examples and conclude with kind of like the most up-to-date understanding that we have at QRI. So important background is, first of all, Marr's levels of analysis, which is David Marr, a cognitive scientist. He has a book called On Vision, which is one of the earliest works on the AI of machine vision. And in the introduction, which is a wonderful, wonderful piece, if you study psychology or cognitive science and you don't read Marr's levels of analysis, you're really missing out on a very, very critical framework. And it's kind of day and night between people who grasp it and people who don't when it comes to the clarity of the discussion. Okay, so this framework is that you can analyze an information processing system by dissecting into 3 layers of abstraction. The first one is essentially what it does, and Marr calls that the computational layer of abstraction, although most people would talk about it as the functional layer of abstraction. In other words, what is the input to output mapping of the system, and what is kind of the runtime complexity, which differentiates 2 systems that maybe have the same input-output mapping, but if the runtime complexity is different, from the outside they have like different causal effects, and that matters. Then there is the algorithmic layer of analysis, which is like not only the input and output, but also the internal ways in which the information is being handled. What are the internal representations? What are the precise algorithms? What kind of like data structures are you using? So that is the algorithmic layer of analysis. And finally, we have the implementation layer of analysis, which is actually how it is built. And like one example here would be an abacus. could be made of wood, it could be made of metal or something like that. But at the algorithmic level of analysis, they're the same. You may be doing the same algorithms. But basically, in this frame, in the classical formulation, each layer under constrains the one underneath. That is to say, there are many ways of generating the same input-output function with the same runtime complexity with many different algorithms. Basically, just knowing the input-output doesn't fully constrain what is actually going on under the hood, so to speak. And likewise, if you're given like pseudocode for a particular algorithm, like that under constrains what is the physical implementation. So that also kind of like really matters. Even though you may read like, okay, like to add or to multiply in an abacus, you do this particular pattern, this procedure, that doesn't tell you whether the abacus is made of wood or metal. Okay, so and I think like for the most part, most like pretty well-informed smart people around tend to basically segment these layers of abstraction and treat them in a piecemeal fashion. I will add though, and this is very critical and actually is absolutely essential to solve the big problem here, is that there is sometimes interaction between the layers of abstraction. Because there are particular physical systems that essentially make some algorithms easier than others. With an extreme example is, if you have access to quantum mechanics, you can basically do quantum computing algorithms that are specifically targeted for these quantum mechanical phenomena. And in that sense, the algorithm actually does touch the implementation layer. And like if you read kind of the pseudocode for a quantum computing algorithm and you don't know that quantum mechanics is a thing, that algorithm doesn't make any sense. You will say like, okay, but what about like this step? You're claiming that this step does a factorization very efficiently, but like how would you do that in practice? And somebody has to tell you, well, actually use the Schrodinger wave function, and okay. In other words, in some contexts, there is actually ways in which the lower layers give rise to particular constraints on the higher layers. And that is very important, and we will come back to that. But classically, they tend to be analyzed in a piecemeal fashion. And importantly, we can basically describe different theories of consciousness in terms of at what layer of abstraction of Marr's levels of analysis do they assign consciousness. There is what I call basically the being function divide, that like different theories of consciousness will say that like, hey, everything above here is just what the algorithm in a sense, well, what the consciousness kind of like looks like to the world, and underneath is like what the consciousness is fundamentally. Okay, so first of all, we have functionalism, and the thing is like people use the term functionalism in a number of different ways. For the purpose of this video, I'll describe it as talking of consciousness as a function, basically as doing a particular type of information processing. And that is concerned with what is the input to output mapping, and maybe even what is the runtime complexity of the system here implemented. Apologies. So that would be functionalism. Then we also have like computational theories of consciousness, and they would say, by and large, that consciousness is happening at the algorithmic level of analysis, which is to say that it's not only the input-output, it's not only like what it does, but also how it does it. And like those internal representations are actually essential. And without those internal representations, and those in particular, the consciousness would be different. So they actually care about like what algorithms are implementing the system. Then we have like causal structural theories, for example, like IIT. And those, they're concerned with the computational layer, basically with the algorithmic layer of analysis, but they add additional constraints. I mean, for them, you could say that they're kind of like at the boundary between the implementation and the computational layer. So like for them, like, yes, particular algorithms have to be instantiated, but then the precise way those algorithms are instantiated also matters. Basically, the information flow only gets quote unquote integrated when the precise causal structure is in place. And finally, you have physicalist theories of consciousness that they will say, consciousness is a thing rather than a process. And at QRI, that's what we actually advocate for physicalist theories. I know this is the underdog nowadays. I'll just say, wait 20 years, mark my words. but yeah, I mean, okay, so like physicalism basically says the world is made of things, actually, particles and fields, and particular configurations of those correspond to instantaneous moments of experiences, and a particular structure of those objects corresponds to actually what's going on at the when it comes to what is the information in the phenomenology of a given experience. I mean, first of all, physicalism fell out of favor for many reasons in philosophy. And the crazy thing is that I agree with those reasons. I actually agree with the criticisms that functionalists and computational theorists provide against physicalism. One of them, for example, is epiphenomenalism, which is like, in what ways is the fact that an embodied physical state has consciousness matter from the point of view of evolution? Like, just because it has kind of like this additional label that says like, oh yeah, and this pattern, by the way, is also conscious. Not only it has this particular behavior, like, what does that add? And that brings us to the hard problem of consciousness. That if you can describe something in terms of form and function, where does the consciousness come into place in here? It seems kind of like really arbitrary and random, and that's a perfectly fair criticism. But I'll have a really good response towards the end of this video. So now let's get onto the classical problems. So first of all, Chinese Room by John Searle, where basically I don't need to go too much into detail because you guys probably know this thought experiment, but basically he's saying that if you have a box or like a room where there's somebody inside with a rule book that allows them to basically take Chinese symbols, do operations on them, and then return some other Chinese symbols, the person inside may like not know at all what they're doing, but then from kind of a system point of view, from outside, it seems like the box is actually smart. It actually has understanding of what is going on. And actually, I remember like in a class on natural language understanding, in the AI, component of the computer science department at Stanford, it was a graduate course. And I remember the Chinese Room was brought up, and I remember the entire room thought it was like, oh, these like silly, stupid philosophy, like, when is philosophy good for anything? Let us just do the work. And basically they all, like, by a very large margin, I think like the vast majority of people in that class and the professors, basically just assumed that, hey, if you have like a system that actually understands from a functional point of view, like you talk to it and it talks back and it passes the Turing test, that like, because that's such a hard problem, such a complicated, information processing that needs to happen with internal representations and a lot of like context brought into place and so on, like that. Yes, of course, that has some like level of like minimal consciousness at the very least. But here's the thing. The Chinese Room is made fun of, but actually I think in a completely unfair way. Why? Because substitute, the person inside the Chinese Room by a lookup table, where like literally, for any combination of symbols that you put in, it just looks up in that lookup table what symbols to return. So there's literally no information about the content of the symbols in the operation that happens. It's just a lookup operation. So just from the point of view of the outside, the input-output mapping is clearly not enough. Because even, within a computational theory of consciousness, account, and a lookup table simply doesn't have the internal representations needed, right? So the Chinese Room, even though the standard kind of argument that Searle presents is like, hey, like you'd never get semantics from syntax. The point is like, like standard responses by a computational theory of consciousness person would say, yes, but like enough, complexity in the syntax actually gives rise to emergent semantics. And I think like that view can be defended to a large extent, but it still requires internal representations, and a lookup table isn't it, So really, I think like the Chinese Room, just to make it more stark, really should be replaced with a lookup table. And then you will see actually people reckoning with kind of this problem. a very classic response that I get when I kind of extend the Chinese room in this way is that the computation did happen and it was conscious, but it was like before when you created the lookup table. And like, sure, like that's one argument, but it still does mean that like you had maybe one conscious experience that now kind of like is able to scale up its behavior in an unconscious fashion. So like you still have the issue that like every time you use the the Chinese room, the machine, the lookup table, like you're not generating a new moment of experience. So like that alone, I think it's a very important part, and that kind of like rules out in a sense like theories of consciousness that just stay at the functional level, because lookup tables can take care of that. So at the computational level though, it's a little bit more tricky, and here's where basically the I actually require to explain what are the actual desiderata, like what is that we are trying to explain when we talk about consciousness. And an analogy here would be, if you're trying to get to the moon, and if you have like a bunch of scientists who are like thinking about how to get into the moon, how to take a person to the moon and back, maybe that entire room of scientists like are aware of maybe like the Newton's laws of motion, in which case they will probably be focusing a lot of their energy into like, okay, how do we achieve escape velocity? And like, truth be told, achieving escape velocity is very important. It's actually a subcomponent of going to the moon and back. But they're also not taking into account, hey, how do we actually seal the spaceship so that people can actually breathe inside? If they're not thinking about it, because they're not aware that out there in space, there's no air, they're not actually solving the full problem. They're maybe solving a component of the problem. And the truth, though, is that in order to actually solve the problem, you need to take into account these constraints simultaneously. Because there's a lot of things that could achieve escape velocity, but they do it at the cost of basically creating completely inhospitable conditions. And likewise, there's many things that could seal the, a spaceship, but just it's too fragile, it cannot, be pushed through. So you require all of that together. You also require like what is the fuel that you need to get out of the moon as well, because it also has a gravity well, like gyroscopes in order to actually get back into the atmosphere in the proper angle. You need to take into account all of that, or you're not actually solving the problem. The same with problems about scientific theory of consciousness. And I think like Mike Johnson in Principia Qualia, he has what I think is like the best frame here, which is that he has basically a decomposition of the problem of consciousness into 8 sub-problems, and the further claim that if we are able to actually solve these 8 sub-problems, it is in a sense a full solution to the hard problem of consciousness, with the caveat that we would still have to explain like why there is something rather than nothing, which is an important aspect. But a more kind of like succinct version of this is like David Pearce has these basically 4 sub-problems that is the one that I tend to emphasize simply because it's like easy to communicate. But when I do actual research, writing these papers, I go into much more detail, which is the 8 sub-problem of consciousness. But okay, so like what are the 4 problems of consciousness that David Pearce offers? First of all, any scientific theory of consciousness must be able to explain why consciousness exists to begin with. Like that's number 1. Number 2 is it has to explain what is the relationship and the nature of all of the qualia values and varieties that we're acquainted with. Like in what way is color qualia and audio qualia related to each other? What is that state space? That is a huge issue, and largely neglected, at least as a complete question. Maybe there's like psychophysics about color, but they're usually not connected with like and what is the geometry of that state space and how does it relate to the geometry of audio and things like that. But at QRI, that's a very big topic for us. Then you also have what is the causal structure of consciousness. In other words, like how is it possible that we're even able to talk about consciousness? That if we were just algorithms processing information, why do we talk about these additional kind of like qualia rather than just talking about information processing per se? Of course, somebody like Daniel Dennett would say like actually qualia is just a shorthand for information processing. We disagree, obviously, but But that's a very important thing that has to be addressed. Also, within that problem, you also have basically why is it that evolution recruited bound states of consciousness for computation or for causal effects. And lastly, you have the binding problem. Like, how is it possible that 100 billion odd neurons, spatially distributed and membrane bound, how can they simultaneously contribute to a unified experience? And that is the thing that actually made me reconsider. Those, like the binding problem, discussions of the binding problem is essentially the thing that convinced me out of, basically a functionalist or computational theory of mind understanding of consciousness. And the main thing is, a lot of functionalist and computational theories of mind people, essentially they dismiss the binding problem. They think of it as a non-issue. For example, somebody like Daniel Dennett might say that we tend to think that our experience is much more rich and bound than it actually is. He has like these examples in Consciousness Explained, where like his book, where like you look at a paper wall and like there's there's like tessellated with Marilyn Monroe's, and like how like there's these visual illusions where like maybe the detail of a lot of those Marilyn Monroe's is like missing, but you kind of like you look at one of them with a lot of detail and it gives you the impression that all of the other ones also have a lot of detail. And he says like, yeah, that's just kind of your brain not even auto-completing it, but telling you or giving you the belief that you auto-completed it, but it's actually illusory, which is actually something I disagree with. I actually think that when your visual field is like auto-completing, in a sense, those patterns are really there in your visual field. That is qualia, and it is very rich. It's just that the mathematical structure of it is actually something that is called mongrels. And mongrels, they don't look like the normal, they don't look like objects. They're actually like these statistical textures. And they have a particular qualia, and it is very rich. So generally speaking, in the world of functionalist and computational theories of consciousness, there is this general kind of dismissal of the binding problem, where they will say something like, you're only really attend to one thing at a time, but you have the impression that you attend to multiple things at once. And here, it's super important to point out the difference between attention and awareness. And the thing is that, yes, people like Dennett and others who are eliminativists or reductionists about consciousness, they tend to essentially only focus on attention. And they think that that is what consciousness is, kind of like the ability to like focus on a particular aspect of your experience. But actually your experience is composed simultaneously of an awareness field, which is massively parallel and has a massive amount of information, but you don't remember it for the most part unless you attended to it. Because attending to things actually gives rise to particular, local feature binding, where like, to actually get a face, you require to attend to it because it requires the binding of, let's say, like the nose and the eyes and the mouth in the proper way, and that requires attention. And for the most part, the only things you can report about your experience are the things you attended to. But that does not mean in the least that you didn't also have an awareness field. And that is actually massively bound. You have an entire kind of like bubble world of experience on every given point in time, even though nominally you're only, attending to something. And I've noticed also that this is particularly difficult to grasp for people who have are on the spectrum, heavy or like Asperger's or mild autism. They find it really difficult actually to make the distinction between awareness and attention, and they tend to identify only with attention and kind of consider awareness illusory. But I think you do require awareness. Basically, what is happening in the center point of your attention only makes sense within the context of the awareness field around you. And without that context, the meaning would be different. So actually, even the meaning of a symbol or something like that contains many pieces of information simultaneously. And it requires that simultaneous coexistence of information, or the meaning wouldn't be there. So basically, what I have to say is that yes, Dennett, yes, we tend to think that our experience is more bound than it is. But even just any non-zero binding still requires a very, very good explanation. And the set of explanations that are thrown around in cognitive science and philosophy of mind are completely dissatisfactory for the most part, unsatisfactory. For example, oftentimes people say binding happens through synchrony, that basically synchronic activation of neurons kind of like binds together the features. But why would that be the case? You know, right now there's like neurons that in my brain and in your brain are firing simultaneously, you know, but they're not coupled together. Like, why would just simultaneous firing actually bind experience? And you know, likewise, you know, somebody like Dennett will say very, very truthfully that there is no center point in the brain where all of the information converges. And the thing is, like, even if there was, you know, like that center point would have like spatial, you know, a spatial depth, you know, it would have like spatial extension. And therefore, like, even no matter how tiny, you know, that point where the information gets concentrated, you would still have to explain how binding happens even within that space. So actually, you know, concentration of information wouldn't solve our problem. It doesn't get solved because you still have spatial extension. So it's a bit more complicated than that. But, you know, somebody like Dennett or other eliminativists and like Brian Tomasic and other people in our sphere, Eliezer Yudkowsky, Luke Malhauser, etc., they essentially throw the towel. Basically, they give up and they say that, yeah, I mean, basically consciousness is just kind of an internal representation of your attention or something like that. And that for that very reason, there's really no center point. Kind of like the unity of it is an illusion. Is part of the content of the illusion is the unity of it. Except that, of course, for it to be an illusion, you know, it has to be presented to you in a unitary way to begin with. So anyway, they have it backwards, but that's fine. Most importantly, though, synchrony of activity is definitely not enough for binding for simple relativistic reasons, because there's no universal frame of reference. So whether two neurons are firing actually at the same time, and I would claim that, like, if you want to use synchrony for like unity of experience, you need actual perfect synchrony. Why? Because what would it mean for things to be just partially overlappingly bound, you know? And I mean, that's a whole issue. It's called neurological nihilism. But yeah, I mean, basically, if a piece of, you know, a process or a physical system belongs to an experience in a loose way, you know, in principle, it could belong to more than one experience. Whereas, and likewise, you have kind of like endless generation of consciousness, because if you have like a system A and you append like something else to that system, such that now you have kind of like system A prime, which is like system A plus that part. A lot of computational theories of consciousness would say that, you know, the consciousness that A alone was generating will continue to be there, except that now you also have A prime. And I don't know about you, but like, you know, this essentially means that you get kind of this combinatorial explosion of actual experiences as you build up a system. And, you know, something like the multi-draft theory of consciousness, or, yeah, Brian Tomasic's take on eliminativism, yeah, basically that's what they're claiming, that there is no ground truth to what is the experience that you're having, because there's actually kind of this patchwork of like overlapping systems that are like loosely instantiating algorithms to various extents. But there's like no kind of like on or off nature of like whether something is conscious or not. Now, on the other hand, how we think of it as at QRI is that no, actually there's discrete moments of experience, and those moments of experience, the degree of consciousness has to do in a sense with how much energy they have and how much information. But you know, no matter how tiny a speck of qualia is, it's still in some sense 100% conscious, because it's 100% made of qualia. You know, I don't think there's any sense in which you could say something like, yeah, this is half nothing and half qualia. Doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, if something is qualia, it's fully qualia. So that's kind of an issue. And also, this kind of like endless multiplication of like observer moments as you complicate a system in a way that just doesn't add up. Whereas, yeah, if you associate consciousness with something like physical energy, actually, you know, a lot of like physical preservation laws come into place, and you cannot do weird consciousness multiplying exploits, like just adding a tiny component to a system, and then you get like the previous system together with the new component and the new, you know, emergent dual system. importantly, and I think I'll move on now to kind of like how we think about these. So how do you actually get something that is frame invariant? And here's where like actually connections with fundamental physics become very relevant, because only once you take into account actually kind of like the four-dimensional nature of space-time, and you take into account kind of the entire space at once, you see that, hey, reality is made of, in a sense, like bundles of energy. And the important thing is that from a causal point of view, actually having things that behave as units can have powerful evolutionary implications. So, okay, I'll just run through a couple things. So, functions are observer dependent. Okay, so like first of all, we think that what a system is doing is something that depends on how you interpret it. And basically, even if you're if you're a functionalist and you say that consciousness is a function, is like something that does a particular type of input-output mapping, that function as a whole doesn't exist. For you to interpret this system as enacting that function, it requires you to, in a sense, take into account in your own mind all of the input at once and think of it as like a unit of information, and then taking into account the entirety of the output at once and taking that, interpreting that as kind of like a unit of an output. But that is happening in your mind, physically in the world, and even from a computational point of view, that information is not a natural kind. Like the information that you fed into the system doesn't stand as a unit other than in your mind. Like in your mind is where that has kind of this irreducible quality, but not physically and not computationally. So that makes really a functionalist accounts of consciousness just not frame invariant. They're just so open to interpretation. And no interpretation is like more true than any other. They're basically just like being assessed in terms of the utility that they may function for you. But without that observer, really, the function doesn't have a frame invariant interpretation. Another very important thing is that you need a principled way in order to solve the binding problem that also allows it to have causal implications. And like, for example, a lot of like kind of free energy principle approaches to consciousness have the problem that dynamic systems don't have natural boundaries. I mean, like, again, like what you interpret to be something a dynamic system is actually up for debate. It really depends on the particular reason, the particular way in which you're interpreting that system for it to actually have a boundary. I guess I should clarify that. So I talk about like the boundary problem and the binding problem. They're really two sides of the same coin. So if you start out with a universe that basically has a bunch of particles and forces between them, then the question is like, okay, how do sets of particles come together to form unified experiences? Where does this kind of like quote unquote strong emergent comes from? And basically, yeah, we claim that in that framework, you need an actual mechanism of action to get that to happen. If you start out with everything being unified, and that is usually actually how we think about it at QRI, that like the universe is fundamentally unified. You have this universal wave function of quantum mechanics whose behavior is governed by the Schrodinger equation. We believe in that. We think that's true. And that wave function inherently works in a holistic fashion. You basically need to take into account the entirety of it in order to know how it evolves over time. And that kind of like fundamental unity then makes us ask the question, how do boundaries emerge such that like you have a moment of experience and I have a moment of experience and we're different, in a sense, moments of experience, or even within yourself over the course of a second, you have many different moments of experiences. So how do those come about? So the question all of a sudden becomes like, okay, how do you get those divisions? And I mean, being frank, most of the researchers in this area that talk about, for example, consciousness as a field, they tend to emphasize that field theories of consciousness solve the binding problem because you have these like underlying unity. Like if you claim that a conscious experience is basically an excitation of the electromagnetic field, like Susan Pocket or McFadden, like in the basically conscious electromagnetic information theory of consciousness. Those academics essentially, emphasize, hey, being a field, consciousness being a field solves the binding problem. What they don't tell you is that then you have the boundary problem, which is like, okay, but why only this patch of the field is actually what you are? And we have a solution. We actually have a solution. And the answer is topological segmentation. Essentially, I've provided this metaphor before, but it's pretty helpful. Like if you have, in a way, a balloon, and you think of the surface of the balloon as representing basically the field of consciousness, that would be the universe in this panpsychist interpretation. It's completely unified, and in that sense, you would be the entire field. So where do kind of like boundaries arise? Where do individual moments of experience arise? So, but then if, let's say, you twist it, and maybe twisting it would be kind of like what the Schrodinger equation is doing to the wave function, to the field. There's a precise moment where you get a pinch point, a topological segmentation. It's kind of like this collapsing of the surface. And here, in a sense, it provides a boundary where like all of a sudden you have all of this region of this field that the only way for you to go from one point in that region to the other one is to go through a pinch point, a one-dimensional collapsed, compactified region of the space. And in this model, actually what we are, these moments of experience, would be kind of these pinch points, except that, maybe we are higher dimensional in that sense. Sorry, I don't mean to sound woo by saying, oh, we are higher dimensional beings or something like that. No, but I mean, the wave function has like, 10 or 11 dimensions, depending on how you count. But most of those dimensions are extremely rolled up, basically compactified. But basically, we are the wave function. We are the universal fields of consciousness. That would be pretty high dimensional. And like what the brain might be doing is basically creating a pinch in those fields, such that now you have these compactified dimensions that have objective boundaries. Okay, and the wonderful thing here is that postulating these objective boundaries actually solves a ton of philosophical problems. In particular, it actually addresses okay, so let's go through like David Pearce's like desiderata. So basically you have why does consciousness exist to begin with? Well, everything is conscious. I mean, the fields of physics are fields of consciousness. In a sense, we are now kind of trading that question to the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Why is consciousness the thing that exists? And for that, I would refer you to my video of zero ontology, why there is something rather than nothing. So we've talked about that to a great extent. And, I'm not going to solve it right here. The second one is, what is the full range of qualia values and varieties that we have access to? And they would be, in a sense, mapped on to different properties of the fields of physics. So, for example, color qualia might have to do with a curl of the electromagnetic field. And I mean, in some sense, like fundamentally what would actually exist is color qualia, and then color qualia behaves in a way that is consistent with basically the curl of the electromagnetic field behaving that way. So it's kind of like switching the ontology around. But yeah, in a sense, like I think what qualia formalism states is that, essentially all of these different mathematical features of the way the fields of physics evolve will map onto particular qualia values and varieties. Then we have where does the binding come from? And the solution would be topological segmentation. Well, the boundary problem. And I think that's really powerful. And in particular, it connects and solves the last one, which is what are the causal properties of consciousness? Like, why are we conscious to begin with? Why did evolution go through the trouble of selecting bound conscious experiences? Well, the reason is that actually having topological segments of the field gives you affordances at the computational level. And here is where it connects to, again, the interaction between the layers of analysis, of Marr's levels of analysis. Why? I mean, similar to how I was talking about how quantum computing basically is a case where you're using properties of the substrate in order to instantiate particular algorithms, so that interaction can happen. And in a sense, the substrate properties constrain or give rise to new algorithms, new classes of algorithms. Likewise, there's this whole field called hypercomputation, and in particular, field computing. It's something that, there's a bunch of academics, for the most part, like not particularly taken seriously for whatever reason, or rather, they say these, and for some reason it just doesn't impact very much the field. But like, for example, like Freeman Dyson was very big into this, how like field computing might actually be kind of the new, just as like how, basically the legacy of Turing is huge in the field of computing. Once we understand how to recruit fields for computation, essentially we will be transitioning from a paradigm of ones and zeros, or digital computing, to a paradigm where basically pictures, entire excitations of fields are, there's an algebra to them where you can combine them and interact them, and they will do interesting information processing steps in a highly efficient way, because you're in a sense harnessing the massive parallelism where every point in the field is in a sense influencing how the rest of the field behaves. So, and there's a classic examples of like field behavior. For example, how water tries to seek its own level. You can use that for a computation, where basically the solution to a particular problem might be when water achieves level. But also like annealing, more generally, the icing problem, for example. Like, how do you find basically a constraint satisfaction problem solution with annealing by like literally taking advantage of kind of physical substrate properties, where like because of the integrated behavior of the field, you're able to basically find solutions that maximize the satisfaction of constraints in a way that is more computationally efficient than you would be able to do just by discretizing the problem and kind of analyzing it piecemeal in a modular fashion. So actually, from this point of view, it's almost kind of the problem that we have, and a lot of mental illness, you could say, is not so much that like we're not able to put things together in our conscious mind, is actually that like because the field starts out unified, a lot of the issues that we have is imperfect modularization. Of course, there's like disorders where like you're too modularized. Like you can imagine like there's some people who are like just too like compartmentalized, and that's also a problem. But yeah, I don't know, like from synesthesia to schizophrenia, to basically like what it's probably like to be a baby. Yeah, basically super synesthetic experiences are kind of the default. If you take a high dose of LSD, like that, it's kind of like, where like all the fields are blending into each other, and you have a basically an uninterrupted flow of energy between them, that will mess up computation. For the most part, at least, like, you're not going to be able to fill out your taxes very effectively, because that requires a lot of like modularization and, working memory and compartmentalization. But you're able to process other kinds of information in a more effective way, like, emotional processing or social intelligence, improving equanimity and things like that. So like, basically there's computational trade-offs. And my very, very, very honest appreciation here is that as we start to understand in what ways consciousness is being used for its field behavior, in a sense, that will give rise to a completely new paradigm of intelligence that actually, generalizes beyond what David Pearce would call the mind-blind IQ tests. That, despite my personal interest in that field, and like I like solving puzzles and so on. That's really just like scratching the surface of what intelligence can be, because ultimately also intelligence has to do with whether you're able to focus on what's significant, and what is significant is hugely contentious. And of course, I believe that what's significant has to do with hedonic tone and valence and eradicating suffering. I almost think that a test of general intelligence is whether you can identify that as kind of one of the main plot points of reality. But yeah, I mean, the point is that holistic intelligence has not only to do with kind of like whether you're able, to solve standard kind of like IQ puzzles type things, but also whether you're able to recruit field behavior in new and novel, interesting ways. And I very much think that, for example, the crazy things that you see on DMT are powerful demonstrations of how field behavior is actually driving, is basically the driver of the computational horsepower of the brain. And yeah, that's something for you to explore. I guess I will end, yeah, basically by saying that a couple things like resonance. We don't think that resonance is enough to solve the binding or boundary problem. I mean, it is very nice that like resonance in fields, it is a holistic behavior that could be recruited by natural selection, and we think that's a piece of the puzzle. But resonance is more of a something that generates functional unity rather than like an actual deep ontological unification. Definitely not at the level of fundamental physics quite yet. But if we can demonstrate that resonance gives rise to topological segmentation, which is something that I'm currently looking into, and it has to do with the cohomology of electromagnetic field behavior, then yes, maybe electromagnetic resonance is actually the solution to the boundary problem, which is, yeah, I'll be very excited to share the output of that research. Another thing is in IIT in particular, so this is kind of a technical footnote, but I do like that in IIT they take the binding problem very seriously, but they have a very strange solution, which is this minimal information partition, which is basically a way of identifying what is the temporal and spatial grain at which integrated causality is happening to the largest extent. And there's like this quote by Giulio Tononi saying that like the where emergent causality is happening to the largest extent has the highest claim of existence, quote unquote. But here's the thing. All of the other integrated causality structures within the system that is being analyzed are still there. The thing that is saying that the minimal information partition is the one that is actually, has the claim of existence is the theory. But physically, they're still there. And that's like very different from like other mechanisms of action where you actually do eliminate everything but, for example, the shortest path, as in like the extremas of physics. So, for example, when you have like in physics like the path of an electron or a photon, and you see that it always goes through the shortest path in terms of like time it will take, it's a super weird behavior, right? Like that light always goes through the shortest path, almost as if it could like smell its path around and just go through the shortest path. It's super weird, right? And for a long time, this was a mystery, the principle of least action. But with quantum mechanics, and in particular like Feynman diagrams, we can understand this finally, which is that the reason why light goes through the shortest path is because it actually goes through every path at once. But all the paths that are, most of the paths cancel each other out, essentially, because very small differences in those paths essentially create very large differences in the phase at which basically the electron arrives at the point of measuring. And well, I recommend like Feynman's lectures on physics and quantum electrodynamics, but the point is that only paths that are like really close to the shortest paths, or in some cases to the longest paths, don't cancel each other out, which is very different than what is going on in IIT, because in IIT is the theory that says that everything else can be neglected. In quantum mechanics, there's an actual mechanism of action that eliminates all the like lesser kind of realities, the paths that didn't matter. So when it comes to like solving the binding or the boundary problem, I think we have to look at, in a sense, frame invariant objective mechanisms that actually have causal implications. Now, I guess I will end with like, yeah, I mean, basically causal accounts for the binding problem, I don't think they work, also because there's no natural boundaries for causality. Like if you imagine two like big dominoes, for example, that fall on top of like another domino and pushes it, and maybe like they're precisely of the weight such that like if only one of them were to fall on that domino, it wouldn't actually tip over. Basically, you have in that situation the problem that in a sense like there's irreducible causality, right? But the problem is that you cannot just say that it was the act of pushing these two dominoes that basically caused, the big domino to fall, because you can also go further back and say like, well, actually the further cause was me pushing it, or further back, all the way back to the Big Bang. And like, there's no actual boundary in which you can say like, okay, these are actually the causes, and everything before is something you can ignore. So in reality, causality works as a weighted network, and a weighted network doesn't have strict boundaries. And so you're not going to be able to solve the boundary problem with causality. It's basically a very big sticking point with IIT, in addition to like their solution to the boundary problem doesn't really add up, because it doesn't actually have a mechanism of action for getting rid of the other, irreducible causal structures. Whereas with integrated field behavior that has topological boundaries, you actually have emergent holistic information processing, which is why evolution would have recruited it. It basically has appropriate causality. It has appropriate, basically causal effects, and it is objective in a way like the binding there is something that any observer would agree on, just as any observer would agree on the fact that there is a pinch point between these two regions of the field in a balloon. And I'll just conclude that this all basically comes to a head with this whole idea that, for example, artificial neural networks are able to understand at this point in time. And the thing is that, they're very impressive. And if you use like something like Deep Dream or like feature visualization technologies, you can basically get the impression that like, hey, like this whole system, if you turn it into a generative system, you could argue that is like conscious because it's like able to detect these high level patterns, and it's in some sense integrating that information. But I'll have to, say very firmly that is like implicit integration. Is implicit information processing, is not frame invariant. It requires you to interpret that the system is doing that. It's not, happening on its own. Whereas how we model at QRI, basically a moment of experience, is that, you are actually a resonance network. And as long as that resonance network, creates a topological pinch in the fields of physics, then that resonance network is really kind of the pocket of energy that comprises your moment of experience. And all of the layers of the hierarchy are in resonance, meaning that when you see an object, well, we can see this object, the parts of the resonant network that are representing the eyes are in resonance as well with the surrounding networks that are representing, let's say, the face, and the same with the entire body and the object, and then your associations with it. And all of that is connected through a network of resonance. And in that sense, that is an actual glue that has actual causal effects. And if you take something like LSD, for example, and you see the eye kind of like start to wiggle, and you feel like, oh shit, like the the eye is kind of like being disassembled, like it's getting dissociated from the rest of the construct. That would be where basically the resonance network is failing there. So like the things that usually are like attaching the eye to the rest of the face are failing, and so you had kind of this disembodied eye. And that matters. And in a sense, like when you have kind of these like dissociated regions of the network, they're still globally bound. They have to, otherwise they would just actually blink out of your experience. But they may be like more loosely bound in the sense that there's like fewer actual network edges that connect them. They're still globally bound, but like locally they may be dissociated from the common features that they're usually bound to, and that has causal effects. Like you may take the wrong turn, if you're driving, or you may like fall for a particular visual illusion if you're not binding properly. So like it has causal effects, like the binding is not epiphenomenal. You actually require this integrated binding in order to actually, drive yourself in the world and respond coherently. So I will just end by saying that indeed, if you want to go to the moon, you need to take into account all of those, constraints. If you want to solve the hard problem of consciousness, if you want to understand what valence is, if you want to understand what's going on psychedelics, you need to take into account all of the constraints that I laid out simultaneously, or your solution will just be partial. It will be something like, yeah, we will just like strap a bunch of fireworks to this chair and hopefully it achieves escape velocity. But out there in space, there's no air, so you will suffocate. Likewise, if you build a neural network in a digital computer, like, yeah, sure, there's some level of implicit information integration, but because there's no binding, there's no actual mechanism of action for binding, whatever you create is just going to stay at the level of mind dust. Now, I'm not saying that that's unintelligent. You can have like a very intelligent, non-sentient system, but there's like a class of problems it's just not going to be able to address, in particular problems of introspection and field behavior. And it's going to have some computational deficiencies relative to us, but vice versa. Field behavior is not optimal for every kind of computation. So yeah, anyway, in the future, there's going to be a seamless integration between, globally bound experiences and, digital computation, and they're going to be synergistic. But the part that is going to matter morally are going to be the integrated experiences. All right, well, this has been a little bit longer than usual, but hope it was worth it. So thank you so much, and I'll talk to you at another time on another topic. Infinite bliss. Take care.